Socialism leads to feudalism. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, welcome back Alex, who's been digging into the details on various government tax regimes and how they can lead to wildly different outcomes for individuals. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going well. A little bit colder today, though.
Oh, and chilly down there. It's not too bad in Brisbane today, so we'll take that.
Always.
Now, interesting article today looking at, well, a couple of terms that people might not be familiar with. So obviously, most people would be familiar with the idea of socialism, not necessarily with feudalism. So I'd love for you to explore those terms. But really, if you give us a bit of background, because you're looking at taxation strategies and you're sort of saying, well, some of those lead to really very unfair outcomes. So can you just give us that big picture overview?
Yeah, so we were looking at, there's two big sort of pieces of policy that have been passed in both Canada and UK, or they're looking at passing them. Canada has gone full socialism, so they're looking to capital gains tax 67%, which is insane. And we can go into a little bit how if inflation is high, capital gains tax should fundamentally be less to account for the hidden inflation tax. So they've got crazy high inflation, and basically whatever's left, they're going to take in capital gains tax now. So that's socialism at its extreme as far as I'm concerned. And then you look at the UK, who on the 10th of June, the Conservative Party spoke about potentially giving a moratorium on capital gains tax for properties and giving people for 2 years. So it's a 2-year moratorium where the landlord can sell to their renters and not pay capital gains. And I actually think it's quite a clever policy. But there's a lot of governments trying a lot of different things, and they're pretty extreme. The one in the UK is a fairly novel new one, and I probably agree with it. But at the end of the day, the governments around the world are just taking more and more, and fundamentally inflation took most of it anyway. So they're taxing you more on what's left.
And you did some numbers in there, and you sort of put out an example. If you had $1 million worth of assets had gone up and what it actually ended up being. This idea of the disincentive of entrepreneurship, that's something that really hits home with me and from the article, because you pointed out that if you've got the high capital gains tax and you've got that high inflation, as you just said before, it effectively eats it away to you're really not getting rewarded for the effort involved. That seems to have broad consequences for society, because we really do need entrepreneurship to be thriving, for the economy to thrive, don't we?
Well, this whole idea of socialism comes from the fact that, the rich have gotten richer. I agree with that, but entrepreneurs seem to be more almost the target, not the entrepreneurs, but people that take risk. You cannot expect people to invest in businesses or try things if you take fundamentally everything off them. So what has happened with the capital gains tax in Canada? So over the last 3.5 years, 4 years, you've had nearly 20% inflation. Now, as we've spoken about before, that inflation is not 20%. That is the government inflation. So I don't even believe that. So let's call it 20% just to keep it in line with the government. So if you invested $1 million 4 years ago in Canada, and you bought an investment property that you've been renting out, and now it's worth $2 million, because we all know what has happened is actually created these huge asset bubbles, but they've gone up. So, but inflation, if you had $1 million before, your $2 million house now, because of inflation and the value of money, that's actually about $1.6 million or $1.7 million from where it was before. Now, capital gains tax is on the million that you've made. So you've made $1 million, and they're going to take 67%. There's a tax-free bracket at the start, which is about 34% on average over the first 250, but you are basically taxed $517,000 plus the $300,000 that was taken in the first place from inflation, leaves you with about $100,000. So you set up a cafe or a small business and you invest $1 million, basically all that risk, you probably don't earn much money in the process doing it, and you're left with 100 grand. Like, the government has taken too much. They've created inflation and they are stripping whatever is left.
And the most compelling part of that example that you just gave for me is the hidden nature of the inflation in that calculation, because people often don't see it. They just make the assumption, well, the 67%, whatever the capital gains part is, they go, okay, I understand that because that's in your face. Like, that's okay.
That's
I
the money
started with
that
this,
I'm
I ended
handing.
with this. That's right. When it comes to the inflation, they don't see it.
Yeah, no, they don't. Well, you feel it,
Yeah.
but you don't see it. And the government just turns around and says, we're going to tax you 50 or 60%, which is where we are right now. But they've stripped so much of the value of that money away from you in the first place that you're left with nothing. So what should happen is, if inflation is high because your dollars have diminished, capital gains tax should actually be less. But what they're doing is they're taking more, spending more, creating more inflation. So that takes even more. And it is just, the value of money is deteriorating. And they're actually just looking for more ways to spend more ways to take more. And it is, the government in Canada was talking about how they need the money to invest in Canada. Well, no entrepreneur's investing in Canada. No business is investing in Canada. So if that's the way you see things, the government basically becomes hostile to any investment in the country.
And I completely agree with that it shouldn't be the government driving that. It should be entrepreneurs, because that we know that system works, and we know when the government tries to control all of it and tries to run the investment, it leads to inefficiencies. There's lots of issues with that. You mentioned before about the UK's tax break for landlords. Now, you said you quite liked that. I think that possibly strikes a balance there where it is putting the incentive back on the individual rather than the collective. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more specifically about that? Because I think it's a model that potentially could work even in a country like Australia.
Yeah, so if you own a house in Australia, like a secondary house, and you've missed the 6-year window that you need to live in it to get your capital gains free, like, I think you have to live in it for 6 months in 6 years to be capital gains free. So let's say you've missed that and you're sitting on a house that, you bought for $1 million 10 years ago. It's probably now worth 5, 6. Like, so you've got a capital gains. The government's going to take 50% of your capital gain, $5 million, $2.5 million. You are never going to buy a house in Sydney for 3.5 becomes crazy challenging compared to what you could buy before. So a lot of people just go, with stamp duty, with capital gains tax, I'm out. So they just sit on the asset if they can. There's no point selling. Might as well give it to your kids later on. But what they've actually done, they've probably recognised this in the UK, which I think is awesome. So what they've said, they announced it on the 10th of June, and they said, if you are renting a property off a landlord who wants to sell, that landlord does not pay capital gains tax for a 2-year period. The renter has to be in there. It does not apply to corporations, only individuals. And what it means is the actual renter has more negotiating power, because that is the only person that the owner can negotiate with. And the owner, if their money's being caught and they can't sell it for the reasons I was going through before, they may be more incentivized to sell it. It actually should help drive down property prices. And giving it the 2-year window makes it quick, and it gives it a good reset, because what happens in the system that we've got at the moment is the wealthier just become wealthier. They have no incentive to sell assets because it just costs them so much money. And if they can hold on to it, they do. So the capital gains tax issue in Canada, who that punishes is the people that are not wealthy enough to hang on to it. So the uber wealthy hang on and get richer with their assets. They probably create bigger asset bubbles because they refuse to sell. And it's the middle to wealthy that get really punished. It's the entrepreneurs that get really punished. And what the UK is doing is an interesting model that should help at least with the property price asset bubble that is in every Western country at the moment.
I really love the way that you're approaching that, like the thinking about it, because they do need to experiment. Clearly, they need to try different things because there needs to be a better solution. The one that comes to everyone's mind is usually tax the rich, right? Like that's the cry that you can make as a politician, and you'll get a lot of cheering in response. But I think you've highlighted throughout the article and throughout the discussion today that it's never a simple process like that, because taxing the rich might sound good in theory, but it ends up being like that. That's what capital gains taxes are effectively. That is the tax the rich strategy, because the argument is, well, the rich are the people with the assets, so when they sell them, we'll tax them. But you pointed out, ultimately, they are the ones that can choose not to sell them. So the tax the rich strategy ends up being, as always is the case, the tax the middle class strategy. That's the danger.
That's exactly right. And, a lot of the house prices around the world, the US in particular, have been driven by corporations, build to rent, those sorts of situations. They don't have to sell, and they just tie up the property market, create asset bubbles, drive up inflation in housing, and that's the whole concept around feudalism, isn't it? Because the really wealthy people, the kings, the lords, the dukes of the olden days, which are probably corporations of today, they don't need to sell. So, putting CGT tax on these properties, the uber wealthy, the corporations, they're not going to sell. They're quite happy with their 5%, 10% return and their capital gains that they get year on year. They can just sit on it. And if they have to sell, they might sell the little, the smaller things, and just to, do that for their lifestyle. They don't need to sell. So they're punishing the wrong people again.
Well, Alex, fascinating discussion, lots of detail in there. Really helpful for people, I think, who are struggling with this at the moment themselves, to get a bit of a context around what happens here, and a little bit more informed around which policies actually work. So thank you for your work on that. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the UK policy works, because I haven't seen it before, and I think it's clever. I think they've put negotiating power in the person's hands that they needed to. So it'll be really interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll watch that one for sure and see how it unfolds. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.